Mark Anderson and his wife, Sarah, lived a peaceful life in a suburban neighborhood. They were the picture of an ordinary couple. Mark worked as a projects manager for a tech company, and Sarah had recently started working from home, managing the household chores and online freelance projects. They didn't have any children yet, but their lives together were fulfilling. They enjoyed quiet evenings, dinners by candlelight, and long walks in the neighborhood. They were happy, just like any young couple should be. However, things started to change gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. It began with Sarah's sudden obsession with listening to music in the bathroom. At first, Mark didn't think much of it. Sarah had always been fond of playing her favorite tunes while getting ready in the morning or taking a relaxing bath. But soon, he noticed that the music became more frequent and peculiar. At first, she would play some pop music or the occasional relaxing instrumental while she was doing her skincare routine. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. But after a few weeks, Sarah started playing the same eerie, melancholic tunes over and over again. Mark had asked her about it several times, but Sarah always just laughed it off. "It's just a playlist I found online," she would say with a shrug. "It helps me relax. Why don't you try it?" Mark thought it was a bit strange, but he let it go. After all, everyone had their quirks, right? But as time went on, it wasn't just the music that was troubling. It was Sarah's behavior that began to change. At first, it was subtle. She seemed a little more distant, a little more aloof. When Mark would come home from work, he would find her standing in the bathroom for hours, completely lost in the music. She would dance to the haunting melodies, sometimes even laughing to herself in a way that seemed almost unnatural. Mark chalked it up to her just being in a good mood. Perhaps it was just stress from work or the isolation of staying at home. Yet, things began to escalate. Sarah started to spend more and more time in the bathroom. She would listen to the same eerie music for hours, and sometimes Mark would even hear her humming along in the dead of night. She started acting strange, too. Her eyes would glaze over as though she were in a trance. One evening, Mark came home later than usual. He entered their home and immediately noticed something was off. The house was unusually silent. Normally, Sarah would be in the kitchen preparing dinner, but tonight, the house was eerily still. There were no sounds of cooking, no clattering of dishes. Everything was just quiet. "Sarah?" Mark called out, a slight concern creeping into his voice. He walked through the house and finally heard the soft hum of the music coming from the bathroom. Mark approached the door, confused and slightly annoyed. This was the third time this week that Sarah had spent hours in the bathroom, completely engrossed in her music. Mark knocked lightly on the door. "Sarah? We need to talk," he called out, but there was no response. Mark opened the door and froze. Inside, Sarah was standing in front of the mirror, her body swaying gently with the music. Her expression was vacant, her eyes unfocused. The eerie music played on the speaker, filling the bathroom with a chilling atmosphere. Mark called out to her again, but she didn't respond. He walked up behind her and placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to break her out of the trance-like state she was in. As soon as his hand made contact with her, she stopped moving. She turned around slowly, her eyes now completely empty, as though she was no longer herself. The vacant expression on her face made Mark's heart skip a beat. It wasn't his wife staring back at him, it was something else entirely. "Sarah?" he asked, his voice shaky now, but she said nothing. Her lips twitched as if she were trying to speak, but nothing came out. Mark's fear grew. Something was wrong. He grabbed her shoulders and shook her gently, trying to snap her out of whatever state she was in. When he did, her eyes seemed to snap back to focus, but not in a comforting way. The moment they locked eyes, Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. Her gaze was cold, emotionless, and utterly alien. "What's going on, Sarah? Please talk to me." But Sarah just laughed a low, hollow laugh. The laugh seemed to echo in the bathroom, the sound unnaturally loud. It wasn't the laughter of his wife. This was something dark and unsettling. Mark took a step back, feeling a chill run through his body. "Turn off the music, Sarah," he said firmly, trying to keep his voice steady. Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she continued to sway gently, still lost in the music. Her eyes were vacant again, as though she wasn't aware of Mark's presence. He reached over to the speaker and turned off the music, replacing it with a calming Quranic recitation that he had on his phone. But the moment the Quranic verses filled the room, Sarah let out a loud, guttural scream that pierced the air. Mark recoiled in fear as she collapsed to the ground. The next few hours were a blur of terror. Mark couldn't understand what was happening to his wife. She lay unconscious in their bed, her body trembling intermittently. Mark stayed by her side, constantly checking her breathing, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. Around dawn, Sarah woke up, but she wasn't herself. She sat up abruptly, her eyes wide and blank, as though she had no memory of the previous events. Mark tried to speak to her, but she didn't respond. She just stared at him, unblinking, for what felt like an eternity. When she finally spoke, her voice was not her own. It was deep, guttural, and cold. "You think you can get rid of me? You will never sleep again," Sarah said, her voice distorted, unrecognizable. Mark felt his blood run cold. He immediately began reciting Quranic verses aloud, his voice trembling with fear. Sarah screamed again, this time louder, as if in pain, and fell back onto the bed. Mark knew that something had taken hold of her, something malevolent, something that was trying to destroy her. In desperation, Mark called a friend, an old acquaintance who had experience with spiritual matters. His friend recommended a local exorcist, someone who had helped others in similar situations. Mark didn't hesitate. He called the exorcist, hoping for a solution. The exorcist arrived that evening, and after Mark explained the situation, they immediately began the ritual of Ruqyah, a spiritual cleansing ritual in which verses from the Quran are recited to expel evil spirits. As the exorcist began the recitation, Sarah's body began to tremble violently. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she let out a terrifying scream, one that made Mark's blood run cold. "Please," Mark begged, his voice shaking. "Help her." The exorcist continued his recitation, but it seemed to be doing little. Sarah was fighting against the exorcism, thrashing about on the bed, screaming in that alien voice. The exorcist took a bottle of water and recited more verses over it, instructing Mark to force Sarah to drink it. The moment the water touched Sarah's lips, she screamed in agony as if the water was burning her from the inside. "Enough!" Mark shouted, his heart breaking as he watched his wife writhe in pain. But the exorcist urged him to keep going. "She has to drink it all, or the spirit will not leave." It took all of Mark's strength to hold Sarah down and get her to drink the water. As soon as she did, she fell unconscious again. The exorcist gave Mark a bottle of blessed water and instructed him to keep it near Sarah at all times. The next day, Sarah woke up, and for the first time in weeks, she was herself again. Her eyes were clear, her voice normal, and she had no memory of the terrifying events that had transpired. Mark was relieved but cautious. He knew that the worst might not be over. That night, as Mark was sleeping, he was suddenly jolted awake by a strange noise. He looked around, but Sarah wasn't in bed. He heard her voice from the bathroom again, soft and eerie, a voice that was not hers. Mark rushed to the bathroom and found Sarah standing in front of the mirror, her back to him. Her eyes were vacant again, and she was muttering something in an incomprehensible language. The moment she turned around, Mark's heart stopped. Her eyes were completely blank, and the same chilling laughter filled the room. "You'll never sleep peacefully again," Sarah's voice said, distorted and unnatural. In that moment, Mark knew they had to leave. He couldn't risk losing her again. He had to do whatever it took to save his wife from whatever malevolent force had taken hold of her. The next morning, Mark packed their belongings and left their home. They moved to a new city, away from the apartment that had become a nightmare. Sarah went through several more sessions of Ruqya, and slowly, the darkness that had consumed her seemed to fade. But Mark would never forget the horrors that had almost taken away his wife. He still keeps a bottle of blessed water with him, as a reminder of the evil that had once tried to destroy everything he loved. Sometimes, when we ignore the warnings and delve into things we don't understand, we invite darkness into our lives. Mark learned that the hard way. If something feels forbidden or wrong, it's for a reason. The haunting wasn't just a test of faith. It was a wake-up call to listen to the signs, trust in the protection of the divine, and never take anything for granted.